So about myself, Steven, affectionately known as Humble, born and raised in the Bronx, New York. Grew up poor, you know. My mom, you know, she did the best she could. Single parent. She came from Puerto Rico when she was 9 years old, and when she was 19, she had me. And by the time she was 26, she had 3 of us. So I had my 2 little sisters. So at 19 years old, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I was raised by my single mom when I was 10 years old. Prior to 10 years old, I had 2 stepfathers, and it was interesting. The parenting skills that I learned from them. There was a lot of abuse, you know, a lot of like physical abuse, and you know, they had me fighting a lot, so there was a lot of violence when I was growing up. So fast forward, I'm 19, and in the street life. I've been, at that point, I want to say I was in part of the street life for a good number of years. I remember going back to maybe about 12 years old, I was really introduced into, you know, drug dealing mostly, and by some older guys. And from the age of 12 to 20, I was pretty much, you know, in and out of like the street life and trying to work these little odd jobs, but didn't really work out. And the real change came when I lost my mom and my sister to that car accident. So I was 19 years old, and my mom and I already had like this weird relationship because she suffered from drugs and alcohol her whole life. So it's another aspect of my life is that I'm a child of someone who suffered from drug addiction and alcohol addiction. And so we were fighting when I lost her, you know, and so that's something that I carried with me, that guilt, for a really long time. I didn't last long actually in the street after that. My mom and my sister passed away in July, and I was facing a murder charge in November of the following year. So I was incarcerated. By that point, I was arrested around 5 times at this point. And at the age of 20, I was about exactly 36 days away from my 21st birthday. And I remember I was in the Bronx House of Detention, and this was 1992, pretty long time ago. And but I still remember being in the Bronx House and it being dark. I was in a bottom bunk, and it was my birthday, exactly today. And I was crying. That's what I remember. I remember I was, you know, under the covers because I didn't want nobody to hear me crying, and it was like, that's not what I wanted to do. That's not where I wanted to be. You know, everybody should have been 21, celebrating somewhere. You know, going out, partying, finally legally, you know, able to drink. And here I was in the Bronx House of Detention, facing, you know, a drug-related murder charge. I wind up doing about 1.5 years in Rikers Island before I copped out, and I wind up taking a plea of 8 to 24, minimum of 8, maximum of 24 years as a first-time felony offender, and serving 14 years in the New York City Department of Corrections. 1.5 years in Rikers Island, and the other 12.5 in about 10 different facilities upstate. I was transferred a lot because of many reasons. Initially, I had gotten in trouble for, I was with the Latin Kings, and so I remember them coming into our cell because we were protesting. This was 1995. We were protesting the double bunks. So they were, I talk about where this started for me, right? I advocacy, actually my advocacy started way before there, but that was when I was really, when I could say that I was really rallying and protesting against the actual system that I was within. So talk about, you know, being within the belly of the beast. And they were forcing the double bunks on us. And we were like, no, we're not gonna do it. You know, we're not gonna do it. So we locked in, we stayed locked in. We did this this action where we didn't come out of our cells for like 3 days. And after that, you know, they came and they did this big institutional search, and they wind up writing a lot of us up, and we wind up being kicked out of there. And I wound up going to, that was actually my second time I went to solitary, solitary confinement. I did about 36 days in the box while I was in downstate correctional facility. And then I got transferred to another maximum, lasted there about a year. So I was transferred a lot because my minimum wasn't for me to be in a maximum prison, you know. It was because of my getting in trouble, my classification initially. But I want to say from around 1996, when I got to Woodburn Correctional Facility, was when I really got introduced to like historical struggle and movement, where I learned about folks, you know, really started studying folks like, you know, Dr. King and Malcolm, started reading Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and Vandana Shiva, and, you know, introduced to, you know, national struggle, and it was just something that just really I gravitated towards, and I was open for. I was looking for something, you know. I was, at this point, I was 25-ish, almost 24, 25, and I still had a good number of years to go, but I wound up meeting some really good people, you know, really good people that were incarcerated with me that became my mentors, and they were the ones, they were serious. Most of them were already either in the college program or had college degrees and pushed me to go to college, and I wound up doing 2 semesters in college before they took away Tap and Pell. And when I really got to Woodburn was when I realized that I could be like a peer educator, peer facilitator. Like I had these skills. I was already bilingual, fluently, you know, I grew up that way. And so it was easy for me to be inside these therapeutic groups that we had, where I would be in both languages. And so because of that, once I learned the skill, it was just something where I didn't even know that I wanted to do. They was like, Steven, you know, you're pretty nice at this. You should teach other people. And I was like, all right. And I did. And this was 1997. I remember I facilitated my first sign language class. I was a sign language interpreter for 4.5 years for the deaf and hard of hearing while I was in Woodburn. And I loved it. I loved it. I took the basic course, which was about 3 months, and then I took the advanced, which was like another 3 or 4 months. And after I took the advanced, I told them, no, now I wanna take the exam so I could be an interpreter. And I was a sign language interpreter for a long time. I could still remember some of that, but I haven't used it for a while. And that was the first thing I taught. I remember standing in front of that classroom for the very first time in my life. And before that, you know, who was I? You know, I was this poor kid raised by a single mother, you know, a throwaway. You know, I was somebody who, you know, sold drugs, who destroyed my community. I was somebody who carried guns and shot at people, you know, and in the end, you know, wind up taking a life, you know, with 2 other people. And I'm accountable for that, you know, and I live with that, you know, 31 years now. So I never taught anything. No one ever even said, Steven, you have a skill that we can benefit from. You know, it was in prison that it happened. You know, it was in there that someone believed in me. And you know, really, I guess it's weird to say, really loved me, you know, in prison. And I still have, you know, my closest friends that I saw one just this morning that I was with in Woodburn back in 1996, you know, and he's my best friend, you know. And from then forward, 1996, all the way up until I was released in 2006, all I did was read, write, speak, educate, organize, you know, collect donations so we could support organizations that were helping us come home, the Coalition for Parole Restoration, which I don't even know if they still exist right now, because this is going back many years, a good 25 plus. And I remember we were in the yard, and they were doing some kind of action out here somewhere in New York, and we wanted to support it from inside. And I remember going around to all the organizations, because I was always part of pretty much every prison organization. I was either a vice president, a secretary, or one of the members, you know, one of the steering committee. It was just something that we did. Those brothers changed my life. They changed my life, you know. They gave me hope that I didn't have. You know, they introduced me to things that I didn't even know existed, like, you know, like our culture. You know, I learned about being, you know, part of this Arawak, Taino, you know, native culture in Puerto Rico and all the Caribbean islands, and you know, being part of this long history of struggle, you know, that helped me shape my sense of identity, and until this day, you know, it's who I am. You know, it's why I do what I do. You know, it's because of them. It's you know, they saw something in me, and I wind up now being the one that's seeing in other people. Because now, fast forward, you know, I was released in 2006, and it only took me 3 years to get off parole, and I was supposed to be on parole for 10. And my last parole officer told me, he was like, Steven, parole is not for you. By the time he put me in for that release, I had already had an associate's degree, and I graduated with honors, by the way. I'm proud of that. I was on the dean's list. I had like 3 semesters where I had perfect 4.0s. Somebody who hated school as a kid. I dropped out of school, actually, you know, and wound up getting my GED out of, like, just, I don't even know why. You know, I had dropped out, all my friends were dropping out, we were in the street, we were selling drugs, and I was like, you know what, I might as well try, let me go take the test. This is 1989. I was high, and I still passed with high scores. Yeah, something about the New York, you know, city public education system, he said, although this was the 70s and 80s. I went back. You know, when I got off parole, I registered as a volunteer with the New York State Department of Corrections, and I went back. I came in the first time to speak as a keynote for the Hispanic Heritage Month. And that was around 2008. And between 2008 and 2020, I always went back every year. I went back either for their World AIDS Day, AIDS walks, their Hispanic Heritage Month events, any kind of event that they had where they were able to bring in civilians, I would come in. I facilitated groups. I had facilitated 3 groups that were specifically for men that were charged with murder, and it was called Coming to Terms, and it was all restorative justice based. And I did 3 cohorts of men, and we had about 15 to 18 people in each one of those, 2 in Sing Sing and 1 in Fishkill Correctional Facility. And I also went back with another group that I was a part of while I was incarcerated called the Network Support Services, which is a therapeutic kind of support group that works inside the prisons and out. They have a network in and network out. And I wind up consulting with them and just going back in as a civilian to do the therapeutic community with the folks that were inside. I went to about, wow, like 6 or 7 different prisons as a civilian, just like this. And I remember walking through Woodburn for the first time, you know, for the first time as a civilian. And the staff advisor was explaining to me, he says, yeah, Steven, you know, I'm really glad you're here because this program really needs someone, you know. At that point, I was training folks to be peer educators under a grant that we had with the New York State Department of Health. I was trained as a health educator. I did HIV counseling testing, Hep C. I'm a Hep C educator. I've done Hep rapid testing. So I went back to train the men who were interested in this program called the Prisoners for AIDS and Counseling and Education. And this is where, you know, anyone who wanted any kind of resource when it comes to anything relating to, you know, sexually transmitted infections, HIV, Hep C, anything of that, anything health related when it comes to that. And we had a great program, and that's where I learned when I was incarcerated, going back. And I remember taking my, again, and I mentioned this earlier, taking my basic, you know, HIV 101, you know, and just falling in love with that, and wind up taking an advance, and then wind up being a facilitator as well. And then I wind up doing the week-long training as a peer educator, and then fast forward, I'm the one doing the trainings. And so it was great. And I was doing counseling and testing. I was testing folks that were inside. I also was doing transitional planning for the HIV folks that were coming home. I love that work. I love that work because I knew what it was to be out here. I was working as a case manager already. So when I went back to do that, I already knew what services to connect them to. If they were coming home, and most of them were coming home for the first time, you know, as people living with, you know, the virus, you know, because they wind up testing when they got incarcerated for the first time. Not that they tested inside, because I've tested for two years in a row. I tested hundreds and never tested one positive. You know, it's that kind of thing. People think that, you know, it's not. Those folks, they wind up, because many of us grow up poor and don't have medical insurance or health care, and so our first doctors are when we get incarcerated. Our first dental care, our first counselors, our first everything is when we get incarcerated, you know? And so I would connect them to housing, income, medication, if they needed counseling, if they wanted to go to school, you know, if you know, because again, they're going home on parole for the first time. I already did that. So when I came back, I had already know what it was to go through parole successfully. And so, you know, I would share all of that. And I really enjoyed doing that, because a lot of them were really scared. You know, I remember this one kid, he was locked up 10 years. 10 years. I think from like his early 20s up until early 30s. And like I said, he tested positive when he got inside. Been on medications, super healthy, but didn't know what it was to go home. And he told me, he was like, I remember sitting from him like this, and he would tell me, Steven, like, I'm really scared. You know, I'm really scared. I don't know what and I sat with him for a while, and I remember connecting him, and I got him a job actually. Yeah, because he wound up working in the housing place that it was a transitional housing, and he wound up working there as a housing manager, and I connected him to medical care. I found his primary care provider, and I connected him to a pharmacy, because I worked briefly at a pharmacy, so I had that connection as well. And I remember I was able to get people medications the same day they came out. The same day I got them a 7-day supply, unless their ADAP kicked in. ADAP is AIDS Drug Assistance Program. Anyway, nerdy stuff that I'm into. When I first came home, I was that guy. So I was scared too. I didn't know what it was to be home as an adult and have all these responsibilities and have to work. I was gone 14 years, you know, from 1992 to 2006. The whole world changed. I got locked up, we had tokens to get in the train. I'm coming home and there's Metro cards, there's cell phones. I had no idea what any of that was. I didn't have a cell phone. I got locked up with a beeper. I remember I had a little white beeper. So I was scared, but I was really blessed, because I built this network of folks from inside. I had a Rolodex when I came home of cards. Every program I took part in, every civilian that came into every prison, I took their information. I wrote to them, I stayed in contact with them. But my biggest support really when I first came out was one of my oldest and dearest friends that I grew up with. His name is Victor. We go back. He was the first guy I met when I moved to the block where, you know, we all grew up in, back in like 1980, 81. And when I first came home, I remember they had transferred me to Queensboro. And I remember waiting in the bullpen, in the cell, the big cell where everybody has their bags and everybody's walking out. And I'm sitting there watching people go out the door. Like they would leave the cell and the COs would walk them out, and I could see the outside. Like I've never seen. For 14 years, I hadn't seen what that was like. Even though I worked outside clearance, but it's not the same. You're still in prison, you're still a prisoner, you're still a slave. Actually, that was the worst time of my whole incarceration, was when I was working outside clearance, when I had the most minimum classification. I was in this outside. It was weird. I was outside the main, and it was the worst. Oh my God. I wound up getting set up there by the corrupt COs and went to the box for 4 months. I was sitting in there watching people leave, and I still was like shaking, like I couldn't believe this was, I was like, nah, they're gonna call me and send me back. Like, no, this is not real. And I knew Victor was outside, because he had told me he was waiting outside. And I remember walking out that door, literally like you're Queens, like you're outside the middle of Queens Bridge, I think it is the area. where they have the prison, Queensboro Correctional Facility. And it's like there's a college there. There's all this. It's like it's alive. You know, it's the weirdest thing to have this dead space where people are, you know, incarcerated. Although for the most part, those folks are transitioning out in that area. So I walked out. It was sunny. It was a warm day. I came home around October. It was early October, and I remember I had my bag, and I walked out, and Victor was like parked on the corner, and he was just standing there. I hadn't thought about this in a while. So he picks me up, and I remember I was like, I had $140, I think, the check that they gave me that I was released with. It's like $10 a year. I came home, that's what they let me go with. And most of that was me saving, trying to save. So he gives me $100 cash, and he's like, you know, and he's talking to me, and like, we're all like, it was like a dream. You know, we're driving, and I remember driving across the bridge for the first time, because we were in Queens and we were going to the Bronx. And him and his wife, when he drove me to the Bronx, it was like him, his sister, his wife, their whole family, they embraced me, they had a little celebration, and they worked for a company, a retail company that did clothing. And so they were like collecting clothes for me. And so when I got there, they had this big box. I was gone 14 years, so I didn't have nothing. You know, I don't know if I said that. When I was released, I didn't even have nowhere to go to live. So Victor was driving me to a drug residential program that I was trying to get into. So where was I? So we're on the drive going, and I'm going across the bridge, and it's surreal to me. Like I still couldn't believe it. We get to before we get to the house with the clothes, that's what it was. We go to the program because, you know, I got to go report, you know, to my address, because that's the stipulation, because I got to go to parole the next day. So we go to the program, and I remember exactly where it is because I worked around there, you know, recently. It was on 147th and Willis Avenue, and it was a drug residential program. And so I get inside, and Victor's waiting for me outside while I'm doing the intake. I do the intake, and the guy asked me, "All right, so Steven, when was the last time you got high?" Mind you, this is 2006. The last time I got high was in Rikers Island, 1994. And he's like, "Really?" I was like, "Yeah, it wasn't my thing, incarcerated." And he's like, "So when was the last time you had a drink?" I was like, "I remember it was New Year's, 94, 95, because the CO had brought us some freaking alcohol to the dorm." And he was like, "This program is not for you. We can't accept you." And I was like, you know, I just came out of prison, right? Like, this is gonna be my address. I don't have another address to go to. And he was like, "We just can't take you." You know, it was a done deal. Had I known that, I would have probably lied on the intake, you know. So now I'm back outside with Victor, and I'm panicking. I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I'm telling Victor, we need to find an address. I gotta stay, I don't have nothing. My little sister, who was my only family at the time, was in a shelter. She was in a DV shelter at the time. And she couldn't really do much, you know, and so he winds up calling a friend of ours that I hadn't seen in over 14 years. And she's somebody that I grew up with. Her brother and I were best friends. And she was like, "Steven, you can stay in my living room until you get yourself together." And I called my PO. I was like, "Look, this is my new address. I remember, it was Jessup Avenue. It was some 17-something Jessup Avenue in the Bronx. It was my first address home. And I stayed there with her in the living room on the floor for about 3 weeks. And I saved up some money because I started working right away. I remember my first job was right next to Queensboro, where they just let me out of. There was this company that was hiring those of us who were formerly incarcerated coming home, because they were getting federal grant money to hire us so we could do phone surveys. So I was like one of those people who would call you and harass you and get on your nerves and talk about, you know, some kind of Goya product or whatever. And I remember I got paid $10 an hour. And they were offering everybody, most of the folks $8 an hour. It's 2006. And those of us that could do it in both languages, in bilingual, so because I could do it in Spanish, they gave me an extra $2 an hour, and I was getting paid $10 an hour. And that was good. That was really good for me, coming home. It lasted about a month, because within the month, I wound up interviewing for a job as a case manager in the field that I talked about previously, HIV. And I remember I interviewed, and I just wanted an entry-level job. It's my first real job. My resume was what I did while I was in prison, like, and I just played with it. They knew, you know. I interviewed well, so well, that they didn't give me the entry-level job. They gave me the next one up, so I became a case manager tech, and it was a Medicaid billable position, and it was like a huge responsibility. The way they worked it at that point, they used the COBRA model of case management, which was super comprehensive, but it was a team of 3. So you had the case manager who was in charge of all of the documentation, the case manager tech, who was the one that provided all of that and actually did all the work. And then there was the follow-up worker, who was the entry level, which is the one that I wanted, you know, just to learn. But anyway, I stayed in that field 11 and a half years. And during that time, when we were talking about, you know, who was my support, my job, my coworkers, you know, my coworkers were my really first my first community that I connected to, and I want to say I had, in these 16 years, I've had a lot of help. I'm not sitting here just because of the work that I put in, because of course I put in some work, you know, it was a lot. I remember my first job, I would clock in, and it was this competition that we had, who would get there earlier. I would be there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would want to be the first one to sign in, and I would stay there until they kicked me out, which was 12 hours later. So normally I worked that first job about 12 hours a day, and they hated me for that, because they were like, see, you shouldn't be working that much. But I loved it. I did a lot. I saved a lot of lives. You know, I know that. You know, because I met people who were dying. I remember one of my clients. She had been positive for about 10 years at this point. She was like 90 pounds. She was homeless, unhoused. She was, you know, addicted to crack cocaine, on the street. And her T-cell count was 4. Yeah, her T-cell count, you know, for those that know, a white blood cell count that protects you from everything. She didn't have any. Like, she could have just caught a cold and died. And within the year, by the time I got through with her, her problem with her doctor was that she was overweight now. So she had to get on a diet. She had her own apartment. She had income, you know, and yeah. And those clients that we see, they also became my family. You know, I always, you know, got close with those folks, because that's who I am. That's who I've always been. You know, I was unhoused, I was homeless, I was on drugs. You know, like I said earlier, I'm a child of you know, I've been around drugs and alcohol and violence my whole life. I don't even remember a time in my childhood where there wasn't violence, where there wasn't screaming, where there wasn't stuff being thrown, where I wasn't ducking, where I wasn't hiding, where I wasn't running or fighting. You know, my earliest memories, like going back to 5, my mom and my first stepfather fighting, and my mom having a black eye, you know, regularly. So, you know, to have that kind of support was really hugely important for me, and it still is. You know, I got that first job because I had people that I knew that I helped while I was incarcerated that were working there. You know, my friend Rob, you know, I remember when Rob made his parole board, you know, I helped him. We put his package together, and then he made it, and he came home, and he was a success story. So by the time I came out, he said, Steven, just get your resume, I'm gonna get you an interview, and the rest is up to you, you know? And it's just like that, and I've done the same. So, what does it mean to me To be formally incarcerated, wow. First, it's 16 years in the making. So I joke around and tell people that call me a returning citizen, that I've returned a long time ago. And so I don't consider myself a returning citizen in that sense. But it's become part of my identity. There's really not much I can do about that because of the trauma that's associated with it. And of course, it's become my career. But even if I was a chef and never took part in anything criminal punishment, criminal justice related, I'll still be someone living with trauma that's related to incarceration. And so someone who is, being formally incarcerated to me it's a process. It's an ever ongoing, never ending process that requires intentional healing, requires for you to be in community, in a loving community, because of, the flashbacks, the depression, and I'm speaking on the I, the insomnia, the jitters, and the sensitivity to noise, light, the inability to really develop loving, intimate relationships, long-lasting. I was married 12 years, and it was awesome and great, and I loved the time, but it's over. And now, we're past that, and we're friends, and we're co-parenting. But it's something that, formerly incarcerated people struggle with, because we lived, especially those who were locked up for a long time, we don't know what it is to have a normal, regular, what they call a normal relationship with other people who are of opposite sex, or who represent different gender expressions and sexual identities. We don't know what that's like when you're, forced into this, space where it's people just like you, right? Your gender, first of all, right? And even though people express them differently, but it's other males, and it's forced. The relationships are forced. Authority is forced. When we meet even when we meet civilians, as people incarcerated, there's this invisible barrier, because all it takes is one little word that to be misinterpreted, and you're either, beat up, or you're definitely written up and sent to the box, and there's always that's always something that we think about. And so for those who are getting ready to come home, and for those who are, right now going through their reentry and reintegration, don't do it alone. Don't even think that you can, because it's gonna hurt a lot more, and it's gonna be a lot harder, because eventually you're gonna figure out that you do need help. And by that point, it's gonna be a lot harder. So look for your loving community, get therapy, get counseling, whatever that is for you. Meditate, if it's a religious community, if that's what works for you. For me, it is a combination. I do it all: therapy, meditate, exercise, bike ride, meditation music, but the most important thing that has been my saving grace is my community. I have someone that I can call, like right now, and they'll hear me, they'll listen, and that's what we need.